So we're going to videotape this, and then we'll have this available on our website, so folks that aren't coming to the meetings will have access to it. So we'll make sure that that's posted after we finish the meeting tonight. Thank you for being here tonight, Lisa. I appreciate you coming out. Budget is always a unique item that we discuss every year. There are requirements for us to have 2 public budget meetings, budget hearings. So this will be our first, and then we'll do the second one prior to the board meeting at 5 o'clock at the central office in Lafayette. If you have questions, we used to do a form if you want to write down a question that you may have, and then once we get to the end, we'll open it up for questions. Then we'll take those questions and try to answer those and see if there's any follow-up as well. I always start off with our mission, ensuring all students graduate ready for college, ready for work, ready for life. And I always try to interject there that every decision that the board makes and the superintendent makes and we collaboratively make together always goes back to the mission, and that is, what are we doing to have an impact on our students? And so we always try to point that out. I always point out the revenue sources that we have because there's a funding formula that we operate under as a school system, and so your revenue sources are your local funding, which is property taxes, other sources, which is real estate, TIV on vehicles, and then SPLOST, and then state funding is our QBE, or our Quality Basic Education, and any categorical grants, and of course our equalization. And equalization for Walker County, based on our poverty level, is definitely been very strong for us over the years. And then the last one is federal funding. Typically Title I, Title II, 6B are the main ones, but we've also had the elementary and secondary school emergency relief, or the ESSER funds, that have been playing in that for the past 3 years, and those are also coming to an end this year. We'll talk a little more about that in just a second. But I always like to point out our revenue sources. Then I specifically like to point out our eSPLOST, our special purpose local option sales tax. It's 1 penny on every dollar spent across the Walker County, across Walker County, that comes back to education and is used for very specific purposes. And those are to fund capital outlay projects. We came up with a nice little catchy thing there: buildings, bonds, books, buses, and bits or bytes. It's all stuff that's going on inside our classrooms and inside of our buildings. And folks get confused about our normal, regular, general budget and our eSPLOST budget. eSPLOST is what you're seeing around the county now with building renovations and turf on our fields. That can't come from the general budget. And so a lot of times folks get a little confused, and that is a confusing thing, to think that you can mix those funds, but you cannot. These I'm going to go through pretty quickly because we've seen these now for the past 3 years. We had federal funds come in post-COVID, and they were all for and directed to the impact of COVID-19 on school systems, and is specifically in the area of learning loss. So a percentage of your funds had to be spent on learning loss. When we get into our planning meeting tonight, the board's had some specific questions about learning loss, and so I'll show you what we've spent that on, as well as the percentage and where we sit going into September 30th of this year, when all those funds have to be expended. But you can see there was a plethora of things we used it for: additional teachers and coaches, parapros, guidance counselors, lots of devices and technology, summer camp opportunities, professional development, which we had 69 teachers here today in their second day of morphology, which is the second part of the OG training. Great stuff for our teachers. Family engagement buses. When we get into the meeting tonight, you guys are going to see a little bit of a look of what those look like currently, and so we're excited about those. We went into new math book, textbook adoptions, manipulatives, the OG training, the supplies that came along with it, then a variety of other things. We also used that money very wisely with our employees, not only to retain them, but also to continue moving that pay scale a little bit for them with the retention bonuses, and then we listed the bus cameras and the bus system. The social emotional support that we gave our students during that time when they were already suffering from the isolation and from the virtual world that we were thrust into, that was a strong component. And then our online enrollment, when people were stopping coming out to things, we gave them the ability to go online and to do their enrollment process versus having to come and physically be in a location. Safe operating plan, obviously we were spending things out of the first one on continuity of budget. That was one, and the other was just protective pieces for our employees. So nurses, sanitation, we bought the 4 scrubbers, hand sanitizer and disinfectant. If you remember, we were buying hand sanitizer in 50-gallon drums at one time, just because one, you couldn't find it, and two, we all needed it. Masks, anything COVID related, that was in our building. So that's just kind of a rundown of what we spent with ESSER funds. Again, we have a dashboard online. You can follow that dashboard and you can see exactly what pot of money and how it was spent and if it's been completely expended. And for the most part, except for the very last one, ours are all showing at 100%. If you look at some of those dashboards, I would encourage you to go look at other school systems. There are still school systems that they're not spending the money, and that's going to be a problem going into September 30. So QBE funding, most people realize that we have a formula that provides our quality basic education. That formula was created in 1985, and it's not been changed since 1985. Historically, it's supposed to provide state funding of 60%, and local funding was supposed to provide the other 40%. And QBE, if you don't know, is based on the number of students that we serve and then how we serve them. And there's a variety of ways in which we serve them, but that's how that formula provides the funding for us as we go forward. What doesn't it provide for? Well, there's a listing of things that you get no QBE funding for that are all part of the team of education here in Walker County. And we couldn't do without any of that. And so that's part of what that local budget picks up. It provides for a certain number of teachers, but not all teachers are funded by the state. And so when we get that $2,500 raise from the governor, which is fantastic, the ones that are on our CPI report and QBE, we get some of that funding for them. Not all of it, but a good portion of it. But we do have a number of teachers that we do not get any funding for because we locally fund them completely. I started to change this, and Rachel and I discussed this, but the state touted this past year that they fully funded transportation this year for the first time. We did the numbers on it. They funded us at $1.8 million, and our budget is 1.3, and our budget is for transportation is what, Rachel? You remember? 7.8 million. So they didn't 100% fund us. So I wanted to make sure that I put on there, they still fund us less than 20% of what we actually need to run our school system. That's something people don't realize. They hear that and they go, well, you got all the money. Well, we really didn't get all the money. We appreciate what they're doing, and we have received more of the bond buses than we have in the past. But that doesn't equate into people benefits, and you'll see that as we get on into the presentation. And then inflation, you guys know what you're paying for things right now. The school system pays those same level of bills each month, and so we're facing those same things. When you look at the potential of expenditure increases for this budget year, we just listed a few of the things that are going to have significant impact. You can see the governor gave the $2,500, and that comes with some money, but that increased our budget by about $2.7 million. Certificated experience. Not everyone is on that step to get their experience level, but every other year, up to 21 years, they do get a level of experience bump. And so that costs us about $1 million a year to provide that. Non-certificated, we have recommended to the board, and it's part of the tentative budget, to offer our non-certificated or our classified staff a $1 an hour plus one step if they're eligible this year. That's approximately $1.7 million. The dollar an hour is about $1.25, and then if they're eligible for a step, it's approximately $475,000. Keep in mind, a lot of our employees have already stepped out. They're at the end of their steps. There's no additional steps for them. So in a situation where you're only looking at a step increase, you have a percentage of your employees who would not get anything this year. If you do the dollar an hour plus the step, then you allow for both. And it's hard not to do something for your non-certificated folks when the governor is doing something for your certificated folks. And so that's a delicate balance that the board has to try to find their way through each year, and we appreciate that. Here's something else that's going up. We've talked about state health benefit going up. It went up 11% this year for our certificated folks, and we have over 900 certificated employees. That went from $18,960 to $21,120 per year per certificated employee who takes insurance. Now, then they pay their own premium, but we pay $21,000 a year for them just to be offered the benefits. Okay, so that's exponentially increased. And I really wanted to point out that in 2024, last year, it's going up this year 11%. It went up last year 67%. Okay, so this has been a huge increase to the local budget, even though they do give us some money for certificated folks. We get no money for our non-certificated. And when you look at our non-certificated, theirs has gone up. It's been an increase of $385 per month. January 25, that's the effective date. It went from $13,340 to $17,420 per year per employee. So that's a 31% increase just on the non-certificated side. And if you remember, last year it went up 18%. Okay, so those are increasing costs for the local budget, and there's no additional money coming from the state to cover any of that cost. That's all a locally funded cost. Okay. Great question that came up from Mr. Wilson during that time was, why not look at possibly outsourcing some of those jobs so that you don't have to pay those benefits? And we ran into that problem a few years ago with custodians. The custodial companies couldn't even find folks to do some of those jobs. So there's a balancing act there, and it is tough to find them outsourced, but it's also something that you have to look at with the local budget. TRS, which continues to be a great tool for us to market to get new teachers in. TRS promised us a couple of years ago they wouldn't go over 20%, right? And they held on for a couple of years. They got all the way to 19.98. You can see effective July 1, it's going to 20.78. Okay. Now, again, that $473,000 is because fewer teachers are out there in the state of Georgia. So fewer people are contributing to TRS. So the employee still gets to put in 6% of their pay. Now the system is putting in 20%, almost 21% for each employee so that they can maintain the credibility and the status of that retirement plan. And for us that are getting close to 30 years, we're thrilled about that. But that's a hard sell sometimes for the local board because of what you're having to put in to maintain that for them. And that's not necessarily the local board's fault. That's just the fact that there are fewer and fewer people going into education. Although I saw Dalton State had a 61% increase in their teacher prep program this year. So that's a good sign that we saw that during their recent graduations. And then this is something I think is very important, that we took things that were in compliance that could be used with ESSER funds. We shifted those out of our general budget and we moved them into an ESSER budget. Now, a variety of those were learning loss related. Ombudsman, Launch, Edgenuity, MAPS, Go Guardian, Guidance, all of that fit under learning loss. All of that now is coming back into the regular budget. That came back in at about $2.2 million that we had to add back to this year's budget. So when you start looking at those expenditures and the increases, keep in mind we had the luxury of using other dollars to offset those costs for 3 years. Now it's having to come back in. Or we had to make the decision, is there anything in there that we didn't need? And I mean, I'll let you talk to anybody that handles those programs, and they'll tell you those programs are vital to the success of our students right now. So, but you have to think about that as they come back into the regular budget. Give you a little bit of an idea of what revenue looks like for us. And if you remember that funding formula, 60-30 or 60-40, so 67% of our money is coming from the state, either through QBE or equalization. Okay, 2% is other. And then you can see local revenue is going to run us about 31%. So we're 9% under what we could be getting from the local digest or the local tax base. We choose to keep that a lower rate so that it does look good for us as a steward of the dollars locally. So I try to make sure that's a great slide for people to see where our funds do come from. So local revenues will be at $36.845 million. This is all estimated at this point. State sources are at $79.613 million, and then other sources were $2,026,000 for a total revenue projected at $118,484,000 for this budget period. Then when you start looking at how we spend that money, you can see instructional services, which is classrooms, administrators, teachers, 65% of what we have budgeted is all going back into classrooms, and most of that is in salaries. Okay, and you'll see another slide here in just a second that explains that a little better as well. There's a 65% rule, used to be, and there's a waiver for that where 65% of what you were spending in your local budget had to be going back to your students or in the classroom, and you can see we're already hitting that. And the next slide will show you a little bit about, well, the numbers are gone in my slide. I don't know why they're gone, but that's okay. I've got it right here so I can tell you. If you're looking at that pie slice, you know what? This is why you have backup copies right here. So let me go to my backup copy. Well, it's not on that one either, so I'm just out. So this right here, this Pac-Man right here, that's salaries and benefits. That represents 88% of our budget. And then this is our operating budget. So people say, y'all got a lot of money down there. That's a huge budget. That's 12% of our dollars is set aside for gas, utilities, electricity, all of those pieces. Okay, so it's when you start looking at it and you start thinking about how are we going to balance this budget, the only way to balance it is to do away with people, because that's where your biggest expenditure is when you start talking about salaries and benefits. And so I just want to make sure that you see it from that perspective. So your revenue's at $118.4 million. We have a beginning fund balance estimated to be right at $30.2 million. That puts us at total revenue and fund balance of $148,748,426. We're looking at an expenditure budget of about $126.2 million, thus meaning we're going to use about $8 million of our reserve balance to balance our budget, and that would leave our fund balance at $22,488,000 at the end of the year on a total budget of $148,743,426. That's kind of the summation of all that we just talked about and where that's going. And then typically what we try to do is then go into a little bit of the millage history. And the reason is the millage rate is what kind of produces the funds locally. Remember that 60-40, which is actually sitting at 67 plus 2, 69 and 31. So we're well below that 40% that we could collect. But you can see we've been pretty consistent with our millage rate for a number of years. It held steady in 3 years there in 2005 to 2008 at 17.55. We rolled back to 17.45. We held at 17.404 from 2010 to 15. I think it's interesting here, as we saw that decrease, that was coming out of the recession too. So we were seeing that our fund balance was growing a little bit and you could still roll back and not lose that additional revenue. We rolled back in 16, 17, and 18, and you can see the associated numbers there. In 19, we went back to the 17,404 that we had for those 5 year period. In 20 and 21, they maintained the rate at 17,404. And then the reason that's in green is because in 22 and 23, the assessed values of homes in Walker County exponentially increased. Not just went up, they exponentially increased. And so we saw that we had to roll back or lower our millage rate because there was so much more value that was being taxed versus probably real value, if that makes any sense. And so in 22, we lowered it to 16,404. In 23, we lowered again to 14.982, which is where we sit today. And we're waiting to get the tax digest and the rollback amount for this year, and that'll be coming over the next few days. Once we get to that millage rate discussion, we have to hold tax levy meetings in August to establish the rate for 24. If we take the rollback, you're not required to do the meetings. Just the one. If you don't take the rollback and you lower or you maintain, you have to hold 3 meetings. One of those is at 5 o'clock before the planning session. One of them is at 11 o'clock the day of the board meeting. One of them is at 6 o'clock the night of the board meeting, and then the board meeting will be at 6:30. That fulfills the requirement. You also have to advertise that in the local digest. You have to show them the calculations with an homestead exemption, fair market value. We'll do all of that once we get that information, and we'll be sharing that with you guys as well. The big discussion has been if the millage rate gets low enough to where your effective millage rate goes below 14. If your effective millage rate goes below 14, you risk losing your equalization money. You remember last year our equalization was over $9 million. This year the state has added a lot of money to equalization and redistributed. Ours actually went up this year when we were expecting it to go down. It went up to $12 million. But we have systems around us that their effective mills are now down in the 10s and 11s, and they're getting 0 for equalization. Now it's a 2-year out. You'll see it happen in 2 years, but still, you got to be thinking about that. If you go below an effective of 14 and you lose $12 million, we got to make up that $12 million somewhere. And so that's a very difficult balance that most folks don't understand. But once you start looking at the numbers and trying to figure out what's best for the school system, you don't want to lose $12 million that's given to you to equal the playing field for your students and your children. So that's definitely a difficult conversation. This is just the OCGA statement about requiring a minimum millage rate, and it talks about once you get to that 14 mills, when you go below that, what potentially that could happen to you. And this is our calculation, and you guys are going to see some additional details about that when we get into the finance discussion in the planning session. But you can see on 17,404, the effective rate was 16.69. Good catch. So it wasn't a drastic difference. And then you go here, and it dropped, actually came up, but it was still under your millage rate. 16,404, it went down to 16.15. When we hit 14.982, we're actually calculating that right now with not all the revenue in, but we're currently calculating last year's 14,982 is going to be less. It's going to be under 14. Okay, so that's a scary place. Now we're hopeful that revenue will come in over the month of June when we close out the books, that we'll still be above 14. But if we're not and we drop below, that means 2 years from now that equalization will be 0. It'll zero out. So we've just got to be real careful as we're looking at that. And this is just talking about what we were expecting this year. We were thinking we were going to lose about $1 million. The state actually increased that, so we went from 9.5 to 12.8. And you can see what the state actually, their equalization budget. And again, remember, they take a 5 mil share from us, the equivalent of 5 mills. Every school district sends in their check for the 5 mil share. Then by formula, they divvy all that money back out to districts based on their poverty level and some other things in their equation. And so it helps, like Title I money. It helps to level the playing field for our students versus a student in a very affluent district, if that makes sense. And so that's a difficult balance, and you guys obviously know that. So, and I don't want to preach on that. That's just showing the increase that the state added to equalization this year, and then how that affected the 5 mil share. And then this is something I just added to the presentation this year. There seems to be a lot of confusion about how we calculate pay for people. The assumption is that if I really like Darlene, and Darlene's a great lady, she is. She can't walk when she's in the Keys, but she's okay. She's a great lady. I can't just offer her money because I think she's a great person or she's going to do a good job. There's a scale that says this is how you pay Darlene, okay? I want to try to clarify that because it gets a little muddy if you're not careful and if you don't do it every day. And guess what? I don't calculate anybody's pay, 0. I'm not going to get involved in that at all. But I think it's important to know this. So our salary scale is based on the state salary schedule, okay? We add a local supplement to it that we choose to do that to make us more marketable to teachers. But it's based on a state salary schedule that every county in the state of Georgia uses, okay? You can be a T4, that means you have a bachelor's degree. A T5, you have a master's degree. A T6, you have a specialist, or a T7, and you have your doctorate, okay? And then we add some things to that too that we've done. And if you've heard, Whitfield and Dalton, their local supplement is quite a bit higher than ours. There's a reason for that. One, they have a little more money in their county. Two, they're dealing with an 80 to 90% Esau population right now. And so they're trying to attract people, and so they've bumped their supplement significantly higher than most places around them, although we are very competitive with our close districts. So this is kind of what our scale would look like, and you can see that the shaded part is talking about what they're going to make in a month, and then the annual salary is listed there too. So you can see, here's the salary step, here's their T4, T6, and T7. This is no experience. They start off at $45,092. T6, same person, no experience, just a different degree, goes to 55, and then a doctorate goes to 60. Okay? So that's on the scale. Then you add to that our local supplement. Well, and that's exactly what I was just saying. Sorry, I should have shifted there. But let's just say that you've got somebody that's got a specialist degree, and they've got 10 years experience. And their contract works them 200 days. Our teachers work 190 days, okay? So this person is going to make $67,000, which is on the scale, for 190 days. Their daily rate's $352.72 a day. That's what they get paid. So you figure that daily rate on the additional days that they work. So they're going to get paid that daily rate for more days. So their 67 actually ends up being 70,544. It's because they work more days than someone else. Well, then you can take that same calculation, and let's use an ag teacher at the high school. They work extended day and extended year. That means they work 51 more days than anyone else. So from 190 to 241 is an additional 51 days. So this person with a specialist, they've been working for us for 10 years. They work 241 days. Their salary for 190 days is $67,017, which is exactly what the scale says, plus our local supplement. Then you multiply their daily rate, which is this $352.72, times the additional days. They end up making $85,000 a year. It's because they're working more days. They're getting paid for the days that they're working. And keep in mind, for an ag teacher, a lot of those days, extended year days, we get money back for them through Perkins money, okay, because they're working on their program, right? So a lot of our high school folks, I'll give you an example. We had a principal with a master's degree. This principal had an assistant principal with a doctorate that was making more money than the principal. It was not because they were more important, it was because one was a doctorate, one was a master's. The doctorate worked 241 days. There was a lot of additional pay there, but it's all on a scale. It's not something we go, you know what, I think he really needs to have X. No, there's a scale. Here's where you fall. This is what it says. That's all I can do for you, okay? I think it's important for us to point that out, because a lot of folks, when you start seeing T4, T5, T6, it's easy to get confused and get lost in it. And then you think local supplement. Then the other thing, at the high school level, even at the middle school level, we have a lot of coaches that get an athletic supplement, okay? Now that athletic supplement doesn't go to help their TRS, but it does help their pay. So when you're looking at their overall pay, you've also got to say, oh, and by the way, he's the head football coach. He's also the tennis coach. He cuts the grass. I mean, you know how they put multiple things in there for him. So there may be another $6,000 or $7,000 on their pay that's not necessarily going to help their TRS pay, but it helps their paycheck that they get every month. Okay, and again, it's based on a formula. It's not based on me just deciding who gets what, or somebody in finance as they're calculating. Just thought it was particularly important for us to kind of talk about that as well, because it is easy to get confused when you hear folks say, well, they make a lot more money than this person. Well, there's a reason that they do. It's because of their number of years, their educational attainment, and the number of days that they work. Like most of my staff, they work 241 days because we work all summer. But your teachers and even some of your assistant principals, they only work 200 days or 210 days. So they get paid those extra days, but they're not working all year long, and so their salary looks a little different. And it's sometimes it gets confusing, even for us. We have to go back and sit down with Tabby or with somebody in finance and say, okay, explain this to me. Just thought that would be good as you're looking at, because remember, 88% of our budget is in people. So it's important for everybody to know kind of how their pay is calculated as well, and then how it fits into the general budget. I flew through that really quickly, so I'll pause and see if anybody from the board might have a question about anything that we talked about or that we missed. We've got several things that we talked about at the called session that were very specific questions. We're going to talk about that in the finance report during the planning session. But are there other questions, or are there any questions from anybody in the audience that we could entertain before we turn it back over to our chairman? Okay, well, thanks for listening.